is what I played for.
Oh, the cuckoo, she's a pretty bird. She warbles as she flies, but she never hollers cuckoo until the 4th day of July. Hello, Mark here. Welcome to episode 8 of the Cuckoo Town podcast. My guest is Bob Osborne, artist, writer, researcher. A few months ago, during some research into a controversial mystery that dates back to 1938 involving Aleister Crowley, I happily stumbled upon Bob Osborne online, and I quickly realised that he was ahead of me in his research. We have since formed an online friendship, and Bob often sends me snippets of his latest findings. Before I met Bob, I knew that D.H. Lawrence had briefly lived at Zena, on the remote far west and north coast of Cornwall, during World War I, and I had more recently realised that Aleister Crowley had lived in that exact same small, no, not even small, but tiny Cornish hamlet too, but around 20 years later. Prior to meeting Bob, I only had a cursory interest in D.H. Lawrence. In my previous ignorance, I hadn't realised quite how important he had been to the 20th century. He was, as I've since discovered, one of the two most important counter-culturalists, the other one, Aleister Crowley. So then, what were the odds that these two gifted men should both be drawn to live in such a remote location? And why there? Were the two men linked? Well, yes, very much so. Listen to Bob now and find out how. The life stories of Lawrence and Crowley touched upon so many different topics that we can discuss. The obvious ones, of course, are literature, art, philosophy, and so-called black magic. Here on Cuckoo Town, we're going to go a little bit deeper. We're going to be discussing how these two countercultural icons, and many other gifted people who were connected to them, changed our world with their forward thinking, their creative ideas, their personal magic. But underpinning that whole inventive process is Lawrence's notion of blood consciousness, something which blends in with a topic that this podcast promotes, that of spirit of place. This is the first, I hope, of many interviews with Bob Osborne. In this interview, we touch upon so many interesting people and subjects. These include British history, remote viewing, clandestine social programs, the security services, the Luciferian agenda, Nazis, witchcraft, Satanism, Enochian rituals, hallucinogenic drugs, brainwashing, prescriptive programming, the Illuminati, nihilism, espionage, legends, a Tregarthen horror, the OTO, Golden Dawn, MK Ultra, Wiccanism, the paranormal, communes and covens, Thelema, Fabianism, the Fourth Way, even the Isle of Wight Pop Festival. Amongst the people we discuss are Crowley and Lawrence, of course, but many others too, including Gurdjieff, Cecil Williamson, Ian Fleming, William Sargent, Ron Hubbard, Catherine Mansfield, Yuri Andropov. Oh, the list is endless. Just listen and enjoy.
Bob Osborne. I'm a writer and an artist. Family background, that's a long story. Father was a Romany gypsy, one of 18. He was a rag and bone man, couldn't read and write. Descended from a guy called Alexander Osborne, who took part in an attempt to overthrow the monarchy in 1685, which was called the Monmouth Rebellion. He escaped the battle that was engaged by Winston Churchill's troops, went into hiding. He was judged by Judge Jeffreys to be a rebel not taken, which is my art brand. So I've incorporated the rebel not taken motif into my art brand, which is also tattooed on my arm. On my mother's side, my father were Romany and English gypsies. On my mother's side, there's also gypsy blood. Her great uncle was a guy called George the Giant Auger. In 1900, he was Queen Victoria's bodyguard. He was 8 foot tall. I like to think it was Nephilim, but in fact, it was probably gigantism.
Okay.
And he was picked out at Barnum and Bailey's circus in London in the crowd because he was taller than their giant. They took him to New York. He went in the freak shows across America, so appeared in the silent movies, or was signed up by Harold Roach to appear in the silent movies with Harold Lloyd. He was 20 years on the stage as Jack and the Beanstalk. So that whole story, I'm hoping to write a book about it. The BBC have interviewed me about it, and I've given them information. On both sides, there's a lot of eccentricity stroke madness in my family. When I was growing up in Notting Hill Gate with my father, we had a pet monkey. We had parrots. They were all, some of them were criminals. One of my uncles was 21 years in Brixton. He was arrested for the Great Train Robbery, which he didn't do.
Oh, right.
It was pretty much quite an anarchic childhood growing up in the 1960s. And if you imagine Steptoe and Son on steroids.
Yes, yeah.
They filmed Steptoe and Son in our stables.
Right.
It was a combination of my grandfather, who was a bare-knuckle boxer, and other totters around at that time. When I was young, it was apparent that I had psychic gifts, as I think most Romneys do. I went to the local school, and I was targeted at this school because I could play chess when I was 7. I don't know how. My dad never taught me. He couldn't read or write. And they did some tests on me and decided I should go to a special school. Given this scholarship, I'm selected, as a lot of the boys are in the poor borough, to go to a grammar school, which turned out to be a Freemason school. I was sent there. Then I was pretty much started the old brainwashing procedures. Got expelled from there, from the Isle of Wight Pop Festival, when I decided I was going to become Jesus. My A-levels at night school while working on a building site. Didn't even go to any lectures, but I remote viewed the papers on the day before the exam. Got full A's. So, psychic gifts were used for good purposes then. I was asked to go to Cambridge. Didn't want to go to Oxford and Cambridge. Went to the University of East Anglia, where I studied creative writing. Wanted to become a poet. That set me on a course of study, research, learn I've been doing for the last 50 years. All my teachers were RAF Battle of Britain pilots. All very odd. There was a lot of abuse, usual stuff.
A lot of damage from the war years, I should imagine.
That's why. Also, there were programs at that time where they were doing experiments on working class children.
Really?
This was managed by a guy called William Sargent. They put you into categories and they do tests on you, plus the beatings, which were all part of a kind of Freemasonry, Luciferian agenda. So I didn't like any of that. So I went to the school and he said, go home, get your hair cut, tidy yourself up and come back tomorrow morning. So I said, no, I'm not going to do any of those things. And then the headmaster really turned on me, the one that had been systematically caning me, and said, you're just like all your type, born in Hammersmith Hospital. You come to the school and then you end up in Wormwood Scrubs, because the hospital, the school and the prison were all in the same street. So that kind of fired me up, because I've always had a very rebellious nature. And when I started studying DNA and things like that, I could understand why I've got this rebel not taken imprint in my psyche. And also DNA carries on. The mitochondria in DNA that we have still consist of 15 generations before it's degraded and can no longer be present. So effectively, we still hold the memory and the consciousness of all our predecessors. So I would memory or the consciousness, which is why I was able at a young age to regress and time travel. So basically I said to this headmaster, thank you very much. You just given me the motivation I need. And I was kind of grateful for the fact that it gave me a complete distrust of authority. So I went to night school, did my A-levels, remote viewed them, got all the A's, and then after that had the most incredible life, moving in and out of different circles, but always with a grudge and resentment against authority, and that they would never own me. So despite attempts by the Freemasons, by MI5 to drag me into their net, I always resisted it.
That's really interesting. You mentioned just now about the remote viewing. Did you just do that instinctively, or were you trained by somebody?
I don't know whether I was trained or not. The thing is, remote viewing, we wouldn't know what remote viewing was because it's getting a lot of coverage at the moment, but effectively it's similar to clairvoyance. The main expert on remote viewing was a Russian called Yuri Andropov, who in their remote viewing training since at least the war, if not before. The Nazis were doing it as well. And we were doing it, or the CIA were doing it, and have a whole network now of people they train to remote view. So it's called fifth generation warfare. This is partly the research I've been doing on people like Crowley and the Nazis, is that they recruit, basically all wars are occult wars. So they recruit people with psychic ability. And it's not just one or two. They have whole networks of teams, like the decoders at Bletchley Park. They astrologers, both Himmler and our lot, including Crowley. Had all organizations of psychics. So remote viewing, to a certain extent, is when you can slip between timelines. So the whole concept of time is that we're not in linear time anymore. You can move backwards and forwards to achieve this, which, is a whole different story. You can either achieve it by sex magic, by hallucinogenic drugs, or just by being psychically open.
Right. You mentioned now, you said anymore. So was there a time, do you think, when it was more structured and it was linear, and then it changed because we've come into a new age?
No, I think that the whole concept of time, of linear time, has been taken away because it's to get to grips with. But we can, what it's like when you go to sleep. When I go to sleep, sometimes I wake up and I know that I've had like 4 days' work or full night's work, I can download information. Depends on your psychic openness. When I was my first memory going to bed, was the fact that the wallpaper patterns would disturb my brain patterns. But at that time, they were putting TVs in every household after the war.
Right.
And what they were just the flicker rate on the TV, which really the early form of brainwashing.
Yes,
the
BBC, British Brainwashing Corporation.
Well, when you're aware of what's going on, so even later when they had the Thames TV, remember the logo on the Thames TV?
Yeah, I remember that.
There Luciferic symbolism for as above, so below.
Wow. Yeah, I've never considered that.
And a lot of those programs were prescriptive programs.
Right.
So when you say remote viewing, I'm using that term now simply because it's a way that it's almost like guesswork or clairvoyance. So when I remote viewed those papers, I was in a state of high stress because I had exams next week and I hadn't done any work. And all I've been doing was working on the building site. I didn't even read. One of the books was Hamlet, which I didn't even read then anyway. So I think when you're in a state of high anxiety or stress, you enter what's called DID, or disassociated identity disorder,
right?
Where a lot of things that they do now with training spies and training agents or super soldiers is they break down their psyche and then they can channel information into them. One is able to do this oneself.
Right.
Of kind of research was done by people like Aldous Huxley, who was one of my absolute villains of the piece. You know, he goes to where I'm living now. Huxley's footprints all over it. So when you get things like Clockwork Horror, example, which is
Stanley Kubrick. Well, Kubrick did the film, didn't he? Who? Anthony Burgess.
Who actually
I'm just reading one of his now, actually. I'm reading, hang on, can you see that?
Which one's that?
Flame into Being.
Oh, that's his story about Lawrence, yeah.
I was just starting in it. Yeah, so sorry, I'm distracting you. Where were we? We talked to Anthony Burgess, Clockwork Orange.
A lot of these things were prescriptive programming or revealing experiments that they were doing at that time,
right,
which fruition. So, I mean, obviously, the Nazis were experts in a lot of the mind control stuff, which is why MK comes from the German mind. As you probably know, a lot of people do know that after the war, they never actually went to Nuremberg. They all got relocated to America.
Yeah, I think there were a few sacrificial lambs, weren't there? And the rest of them, as you say, thousands of them went to America.
The first one, he was the first guy to be hung.
Yeah.
Because he was such a loser. But he was active down here in the 30s as well. So von Ribbentrop fits into the whole spy rings that were going on down here.
Yeah, that I find that fascinating, the links between the local people and these Germans coming in the 30s.
Started with Frida Lawrence.
That's one of the questions I was going to ask you. Was she really a spy?
That's a very complicated.
Right.
Just backtracking a little bit, Tregethen, as you know, is in a very strange part of Cornwall. It's full of, it's really at the centre of paranormal activity.
Right.
And the house I'm in butts onto a place called Wicker, which has got a whole history of its own. The combination of the remoteness, the Celtic mythology, the Arthurian legends, the number of witches there are in the area, attracted a lot of interest from the outside. And Frida Lawrence, or Frida von Richthofen,
Baron von Richthofen's cousin.
She was the cousin of Baron von Richthofen. She, in 1912, was from a high-up military family who were probably the closest you can get to the Bavarian Illuminati.
Right, okay. Yes, I do.
Illuminati, Freemasonry lodges, secret societies, occult. Germans have been obsessed with this for hundreds of years, came to fruition with in the 20th century. Well, she, in 1912, was on this commune, and this was the first real commune that was set up that set the precedence for what was going to happen much later in the 20th century, including here at Tregethen.
Yes.
So she fell under the brainwashing of a guy called Otto Gross, who was a psychoanalyst. Not many people would know about Gross because he died very young in a mental institution. He was put there by his father. But he was the one that Jung learned all of his theories about anti-psychiatry from. And also Freud earmarked him to be the psychoanalyst of the 20th century. So at this commune, a lot of these ideas were established, including nihilism. It was full of people like Hermann Hesse, Kropotkin, Isadora Duncan. So really that whole New Age philosophy, with Luciferian undertones, was established at this commune in 1912.
Can I ask, where was this in Germany, this original commune?
It's on the border. It's in a place called Ascona, and it's in a bit called Mont Verita, which is called Mountain of Truth. It's actually on the French-Swiss border.
Oh, right. Okay.
Frida von Richthofen grew up in a chateau nearby, very intellectual family. So she was instrumental in these activities at the time. So she had an affair with Otto Gross, the psychiatrist.
Right.
He was also having an affair with her sister, and he had a child with her sister. He also had his own wife called Frida, who had a child with. Frida at that time was also having an affair with Max Weber, the German Prime Minister, and his brother
Right.
Arnold, I think. So basically, Frida was a very intellectual bohemian nymphomaniac.
With a lot of energy. I was just thinking that, yeah.
Exactly. But she was one of these people who was able to channel all this information. And technically, when she met D.H. Lawrence, she had 3 children by Lawrence's professor, a guy called Ernest Weekly.
Yeah.
She left him, and within 20 minutes of meeting Lawrence, she was in bed with him.
Really?
I mean, this was great for Lawrence, son of a coal miner. But he then, I'm not saying that she was his handler, but he took on all these philosophies.
So she influenced him heavily.
Then to dominate the 20th century.
Yes.
So when they decided First World War happened, they had a vision to create an artistic community. Lawrence had this vision of...
Is this Ranahim, is it?
Yes, that's why this is all very relevant to where I live now.
Yes.
So Ranahim was a concept where you have a utopian community of free thinkers who don't obey any of the rules. They're outside the system. They're all intellectual elites. You create, another form of society. So this was the template for this was at Mont Verita, and a lot of those people who then went on to do other things like psychiatrists, writers, artists. There was a whole panoply of all the finest minds of the generation that were under this influence from this philosopher. So they came to Tregarthen. He was out walking at the end of where I lived, decided this was the place which he would form this community with Frida, with another guy called Philip Heseltine, who was a musician.
That's right, yeah.
Who changed his name later to Peter Warlock.
Warlock, yeah.
So there was Catherine Mansfield, who was...
I was thinking, I get confused with this. So it's Catherine Mansfield. She was a New Zealander?
There was 5 of them. I mean, there was D.H. Lawrence, who was pretty much educated by Frida von Richthofen.
Right.
They had mutual friends in Catherine Mansfield, who was a New Zealand writer.
Yes.
Who was also very good friends with Virginia Woolf.
Middleton and Murray, wasn't it? Yeah. Murray. Yeah.
There was also Philip Heseltine, who was an occultist even at that stage, who changed his name to Peter Warlock.
And wasn't there a Cecil, somebody who lived a mile or... Cecil Gray.
Cecil Gray came in 1918.
Right.
Effectively, this little community here at Tregarthen, which is divided into 2, there's Lower Tregarthen, which is the farmhouse where I am,
right, and
there's Higher Tregarthen, which is 3 cottages just down the lane.
Okay.
This place has always been a centre of let's put it paranormal activity with shaped-in witches. My house has been lived in by witches. There's something in the air, as you probably know. So this commune pretty much fell apart, but they were all engaged in cult explorations, let's put it that way. Everyone apart from D.H. Lawrence was under the influence of Aleister Crowley. So Warlock was a follower of Crowley, and they adopted his Thelema religion. Middleton Murray and Catherine Mansfield at that time were both writing for the Occult Review, which was hosted by Crowley. And it was through Lawrence and Crowley weren't actually compatible because they were both saw themselves as messiahs.
Did they ever meet?
It's difficult to be sure that they actually met because Lawrence died quite young and was always travelling around. I mean, Crowley, of course, was everywhere. Everywhere there was a war or activity, he was there. But he was here in Tregarthen. He spent a year here in 1938.
Yes.
But that's after Lawrence had left.
After he'd left, yeah.
But the influence that Crowley had on that group of elite bohemian intellectuals was phenomenal. So Lawrence's ideas that were incorporated into a lot of his novels, the intellectual concepts that came out of this commune in Ascona.
Right.
And subsequently, Middleton Murray, who was very much part of the English establishment, went on to form a commune in the 30s and then one in the 40s as well in Essex. He subsequently had an affair with Frida Richthofen, who was Lawrence's wife. Peter Warlock carried on research and sciences and things like that, occult rituals, eventually gassed himself after writing some very moody Celtic music that was based on his appearances here.
Right.
Catherine Mansfield, ironically, said that she didn't like Crowley at the time, but she spent her last years, she had, I think it was tuberculosis, in a sanatorium in Switzerland. Then she went into the Gurdjieff. You know Gurdjieff?
Yeah.
Well, this is really interesting. A lot of the people at that time, like the Fabian liberals, didn't really want to be associated with Crowley. Right. So Catherine Mansfield was always a bit disparaging of him, although she smoked cannabis with him, and they used to hang out a lot at places like the Café Royal in London. When she got ill, she was studying the fourth way, or the fourth dimension, which is a philosophy that connects to Gurdjieff. She went to Fontainebleau in 1922 to stay in one of his retreats that he was running.
Yes.
In 1922, Crowley set up his occult research centre in Fontainebleau, which is near Paris. Gurdjieff used his offices. There's kind of evidence which is difficult to prove in that Gurdjieff wasn't actually Russian at all. He was an Eastender called Frederick Duttel, and he was working for the Secret Services here.
Right.
And possibly also for the Russians. So he had a whole fake identity set up. So the links between art, magic, and the intelligence world or the spy world, something that really interests me. And that's where I've done most of my research. I went to the Witchcraft Museum on Halloween, actually, which was unfortunate because it was full of tourists. But it was the last day before they closed for the winter. And I wanted to go there because I've been researching a guy called Cecil Williamson, who actually set up the Witchcraft Museum in Boscastle. Now, Cecil Williamson, during the war, was part of a group, I think they were called the Project Intrepid, along with Ian Fleming, Crowley.
Dennis Wheatley?
Dennis Wheatley, yeah.
Yeah.
They were all working for MI5, as was people like Roald Dahl, and there was loads of others. There was Maxwell Knight. A lot of people that were in the literary world were also working in intelligence services, clearly, because they had skills. So Williamson was put in place by Crowley, who set up a coven here called the Penwith Coven.
Right, yes, yeah.
And Williamson was also influenced by, or part of that whole Wicca crowd as well. But his main work doing psychic warfare for MI5, so they would infiltrate each other's groups. So Crowley was the master of this from the First World War. So he infiltrated the Golden Dawn, he infiltrated the OTO, and he was then a chief of the OTO in the UK. Subsequently, he went to Los Angeles and set up the OTO there, which was then passed on to people like Ron Hubbard and Leary, were all involved. But Cecil Williamson was working, supposedly collecting folklore, researching folklore in Germany. But in fact, what they were doing, they were infiltrating each other's occult societies.
Right.
Now, it's very interesting the way this was panning out, because a lot of the English aristocracy at that time in the 30s, as usual, were pretty decadent. So the people that were running German occult societies and the people that were running over here are pretty much the same people. So the war was business as far as they were concerned. Their main activity was
a lot of interrelated.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they all knew each other. They were all chums with each other.
Yeah.
A guy called Lord Tredegar, very eccentric aristocrat, had a castle here. And, he was getting, Hess was coming over. He was visiting Ernst Bohm in Germany. They were getting rent boys. They were getting lots of people like Lloyd George. And Crowley managed to infiltrate a lot of these societies because he had access to what he would term sex magic, and also the Enochian rituals that they were all very involved with, because a lot of them were dabbling in Rosicrucianism. Freemasonry was linked to most of these ritual practices. Yeah. In 33, when the Third Reich was being put together, funded by Western banks, I might add, Crowley was in Berlin, of course. He was having exhibitions, and he was kicked out of Berlin just like he was kicked out of Italy in 1922. And it's probably not so much that he was involved in black magic rituals, which was a bit of a cover for his other covert activities. But his books, especially his book of the law, the Lima religion, Hitler was kind of very wary, as they all were, of Crowley, because they weren't quite sure whose side he was on, because during the First World War, he was writing propaganda for the Germans in a magazine called The Fatherland.
That's in New York, yeah.
Well, he was also at Montauk doing ritual opening portals at Montauk, which led to the Philadelphia experiment. That's a whole different story. So Crowley was thrown out of Berlin in the 30s, but during that time in the 30s, nobody knew who he was working for. Even MI5 and MI6 weren't sure, because he was at a level higher than all of those. And also, being a master spy and a double agent, nobody was quite sure. Although Kim Philby in 42 did confirm that he was working that time for the British. He passing off information to the KGB, but what becomes apparent is that a lot of these people all knew each other, all hang out in the same social circle. Talking about the German aristocracy, the English, the German occultists, the English occultists. So effectively, they were fighting a kind of a transcendental spiritual war with each other as well, over their rivaling esoteric philosophies, because there's been lots for the last 600-700 years between these societies in order to gain power. And the way they can gain power is through what they would term magic rather than kinetic warfare. So the psychic spying, even Churchill, who was a druid, bought fully into this, and he had teams of decoders, astrologers. Hess was coming over. Ribbentrop came to St Ives in the 30s.
He played golf with Peter Lanyon's
father-in-law.
Father-in-law, was it?
Yeah, I mean, when I found out that where I live, as you know, is very remote. There's basically 3 cottages and the farm where I am.
Right.
There's no sign. It's between Zenor and St Ives in an idyllic but completely shut-off location. No one knows where it is. So during the First World War, we had D.H. Lawrence, Frieda von Richthofen, all the other composers and musicians that stayed here. And then all through the 20s, and into the 30s, we had Crowley performing his black magic rituals here, living in the here. All through the 50s, more and more artists coming and going. So it's really strange. And when I found that Ribbentrop had been here in 38, I wanted to know why he was here. Initially, he came supposedly to take photographs of the English coastline because the Germans, the Nazis, have always been obsessed with Cornwall because of a combination of Arthurian legend, the ley lines, the occult, and the fact that if they thought they could occupy Britain, they would
launch like a launching pad, isn't it? Really, they
would have Cornwall as their headquarters.
Yeah, so that's why they hit. Is that why they hit Plymouth so hard?
Yeah, they hit Plymouth because they shut it off at Tamar Bridge.
It's just perfect border, isn't it?
Ribbentrop was sent out to do reconnaissance.
Yeah,
he infiltrated his way into the aristocratic world down here, which wasn't difficult because
the Bolithos,
the royal families, the Bolithos, they were all pretty much.
Yeah, they were flirting with Nazism anyway, weren't they? Like the royal family were.
Yeah, totally. I mean, they were.
They were. Yeah, well, they were some part German anyway.
Saxe-Coburgs were German, were Nazis. And, there wasn't much difference really between the ruling classes of both countries, which is why it gets a bit complicated when you say that someone's spying for one country or another. What they were doing, they were colluding in their own private little wars. But I found out that there was a guy who's the son of a famous painter called Peter Lanyon, who is one of the St Ives' most well-known painters, and he did some good research on Ribbentrop being here, and I've done my own independent research as well. And he initially came to stay in the Tregenna Castle. He fell in love with St Ives, which is not surprising.
Yes, beautiful building.
And then he told everyone that if the Germans had won the war, which at that time, later it looked like they would do, he wanted to have his headquarters there. Hitler was going to live in St Michael's Mount.
Oh, right.
And they were going to, so there's rumours they did deals with the landowners like Aleister and St Aubin, that if the Germans occupied Cornwall, they would still keep their land. So combination of political deals and all the occult ritual that was going on, that partly Crowley was involved with running both sides, had witness testimonies about people going to St Michael's Mount, which has got satanic vibes, and watching sacrifice there. So a lot of these things have been going on for a long time in this part of Cornwall.
Right. When was this said to have taken place? Are we talking in the past, in the 30s?
No, this has been going on for a long time, but I had 2 witness statements from people that in the last 20, 30 years as children, they were taking ceremonies in the dungeons at St Michael's Mount. Von Ribbentrop vehikled his way into society down here. He was playing golf with Peter Lanyon's father-in-law, who was a colonel.
Right.
He stayed at the Bolitho Lodge, a Bolitho estate in Tregwenton.
Yes, I've been there.
Crowley was around in 38. This was the pivotal year. When von Ribbentrop was here. Crowley was here because he fathered a child Ataturk with a woman who was also involved in a lot of things, including MI5 and the Thine family.
So hang on.
She was the high priestess of the coven that he set up.
Was this Pat Doherty?
Pat Doherty, yeah.
Yeah. Also known as Mama.
She's a really interesting woman. I do know people that knew her. Granddaughter of a famous painter called Gotch, who was a Newlyn sculptor. So she was well-to-do. She developed an early interest in the occult because she was psychic. And how can I put this? She was hanging out with a guy called Robin Tyne, who's part of the Marquis of Barn family. He was controlling the Penwith Coven. Now, Robin Tyne dates his ancestry back to the Thynes, who were working with John Dee, Elizabeth I, magician. Tyne was also interested in these occult matters and very learned because they'd inherited a lot of this information. He was put in place to run the Penwith Coven, which also involved Cecil Williamson and Crowley, because Crowley would go around and set up these covens all over the place. He did them in Sicily and pretty much everywhere he went. So she was in a relationship with Robin Thynne. She had various children, and she was called Mama because she would bring African children into Newlyn and give them foster homes. I did try and go down that rabbit hole, but couldn't really get very far with it. But in any case, clearly a very empathetic woman. But she suddenly decided, when Crowley was in court up for what's called the Laughing Torso trial, which was he was arrested for the activities that he engaged in Thelema Abbey in Sicily in 1922, I think it was, when he involved goat sacrifice and things like that, and he was just getting his Thelemic rituals, off the ground and incorporating other people into commune. So he was setting up a commune in Sicily, pretty much a couple of years after the commune that was set here in Tregethen, which was up and running all through the century. So he was also involved in communes or commons. I mean, commune coven. It's like there's similarity between the cult activities that take place there. He was running a commune in Newlyn. Pat Doherty decided she wanted to have a child by Crowley, which was a moon child, and that relates to...
Is that Ataturk, is it?
Ataturk, yeah. Relates to the philosophies about, the combining of the male and female energy, and androgyny, and also the solar and the lunar. It's a very complicated theosophical belief system, which a lot of the members of the ruling class or the elites or whatever you want to call them, the cabal, the deep state, adhere to. In terms of breeding programs, controlling DNA. So she had a child with Ataturk, and she ditched Robin Thynne, but Thynne crops up again in the lives of many artists that were working here at Tregethen, as does Crowley. Pat Doherty then didn't want to... Crowley was at this stage was quite elderly, so she had his child. Then she married a guy called John McAlpine, who Crowley
MI5, wasn't he?
Who was MI5. He was an early kind of James Bond type. Crowley had introduced them during the war, but in any case, she then went to Cairo with him. He was assassinated in the Balkans on some mishap. She had several aliases. She had also a previous husband who was a French earl who she adopted the type of Marquess. There's been a lot of denial about her being involved in this coven, but the evidence is pretty overwhelming that there was a coven.
Were they connected to Girthan horror? In the stories, in the fictional versions, they had the scallop shell, I think they called it, which was the lobster pot. Was it lobster pot?
That's the lobster pot, yeah.
Yeah, and she supposedly ran it on behalf of Crowley, and that was their sort of organisational place where they sort of lured people in to sort of compromise them so they could use them. Am I getting that right? Or
I mean, I know you've read the Tregethen Horror, which was some really good research.
It's a brilliant book. Lots of. Can I just bring into the subject something which I read? I never know how to pronounce her name, but I'm going to say Eiffel Colquhoun.
Eiffel Colquhoun, yeah.
Yeah, it's a tough one for me. Yeah. Anyway, she's got a whole chapter, Crowley and Cornwall, and I have to say, I mean, even from what little I know about this, she didn't seem to know anything.
She knew everything, but she didn't. She covered it up.
Oh right, because she basically tells the Whopper that oh no, Crowley was only ever here on holiday, and
it's absolutely rubbish.
That's what I thought.
I did research her. She's a very good artist, and she was a top surrealist at the time, also an occultist. And she was subsequently in her own secret society. She was au fait with all of Blavatsky's theories, all about Crowley's theories. She didn't agree with Crowley's Thelema religion. She was more inclined towards Wiccanism. So, it sounds a bit crazy and esoteric, the fact that these people are all falling out about which particular deity or belief system they worship. But there were occult wars between all of them. And just like it's kind of a more advanced form of politics. So they were falling out with each other and discrediting each other for various reasons. Now, Colquhoun was always interested in the occult, and I know that book that she wrote. I read it, and I was, I knew that
the Living Stones.
Exactly.
Yeah, Living Stones.
She did do research on the ley lines, but she subsequently said in other interviews that she does accept that in 1938 that he was here for like 8 or 9 months, which he was.
Oh, she came clean on that.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, she quoted a guy called Frederick Tong who lived at Gurnard's Head, who said that Crowley lived in one of the cottages here, and also when you look at the letters or the work of people like Sven Berlin and Brian Winter,
I'm fascinated by
about.
Sven Berlin. Yeah.
Yeah, well, quite rightly.
That's what really sucked me into all this, really. And that's where the Cuckoo Town podcast gets its name from. The Cuckoo Town that's one of the major reasons I call it Cuckoo Town. Because
that's from the Dark Monarch, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and that's what he called St. Ives, Cuckoo Town. Yeah.
Well, Berlin knew what was going on.
Yes.
But he was run out of St. Ives because the elite or the art mafia, the occult groups that were running the show, basically was hinting that there's a lot of paranormal undertones in what goes on here, which certainly the Khan where Brian Winter moved into. Both Berlin and Brian Winter were two of the kind of predominant artists that were both very heavily influenced by D.H. Lawrence. So one of the reasons they came here, as was the reason why people like Gerard Vaughan, who then occupied the Khan and was involved the night that Carl Cox was. Yeah,
with his wife, Ella Line.
Ella Lane, yeah. I mean, I know all about that as well. That's a very long story, a very web. But he was also under surveillance constantly for spying.
In one of those fictional versions, the artist, I forget the name they gave him in the fictional version, but he turned out to be like MI5, and he was just there to keep an eye on the Crowley character, who obviously didn't call Crowley. I can't remember what they called him now.
It was Sylvester, wasn't it?
Sylvester, that's right. Yeah.
Nathaniel Sylvester.
Yeah.
So that book, Talk of the Devil, which I know you've read.
Yes.
And I think we discussed this because it was written by a guy called Frank Baker.
Yes.
Who was very much part of the world, but he wasn't in what we call the Freemasonry elite or the inner circle. He was always on the outside of things. He wrote a book called Talk of the Devil, and he put it in an allegorical book because basically his version of events is pretty spot on from what I can gather. So he changed people's names. What started off as like cult ritual sacrifice turns out to be a much more complicated cover, as usual, which has happened many times before, for the real skullduggery, which was to do with espionage and Nazi spy rings and things like that.
Yeah.
So the book, all the characters, like Crowley's in it, Arnold Forster, who lived at Eagle's Nest and had an identity as a German because he was living in Geneva. He was heavily involved with the League of Nations and the United Nations. That's
right, yeah.
Various organisation, set up by the liberal Fabians, based on Luciferian principles.
Well, in the novel, they had him painted the other way, didn't they? They had him down as a Nazi, but his
the fact that he was here in 1938. Ribbentrop was here. The Dalai Lama was here. That's a whole different story. The Tibetan occultists, the Buddhists. I've had Tibetan Buddhists staying in this house when I've rented this house. And Dalai Lama tried to buy the Khan. You might need to tell your audience some stage about the Khan and its kind of mysterious history, but it's a fantastic story in its own right. Frank Baker, when I got in touch with his son, who lives nearby, Llewellyn, I also invited him around for supper because I wanted to, really pick his brains about Frank Baker. Frank Baker had come under the influence of a guy called Arthur Machen, who was a famous occultist down here.
Right. Okay. I'm reading the Hill of Dreams. I'm sort of halfway through that. It's fantastic.
One of the premises of Machen, both Machen and Baker, in the sense that they were both religious, the suppression of pantheistic, orgiastic activity. So they both had a bit of a problem with sex and things like that. So it's probably why they weren't invited into sort of like the cults that were going on down here, because they were a bit...
Right. So they were on the fringes of it, really. They were
on the fringes. But Baker observed all of these things, and he clearly felt that he had to put this into a novel that reads like an absolute whodunit. It's almost in the form of one of those Pulp Fiction books, because people read it and think, oh, this is an incredible story. Everything that was in there was pretty much spot on, because there was a coven in Mausol that was run from what used to be the Lobster Pot.
Yeah, the little calf,
That was run by a woman called Wynne Henderson, who was also involved with MI5. Wynne Henderson is Olive Nagel in Baker's book. She was a high priestess of the coven that Robin Thine had set up and that Crowley was running. So Crowley was running the Lobster Pot he used to go in there with Dylan Thomas, who was also living there at the time.
Yes, I remember reading that, yeah.
Dylan Thomas and Caitlin came down at that time because they were friends with Augustus John. Later,
right.
but Dylan Thomas used to come down, hang out with Augustus John and drink and stuff like that. But he was very frightened of Aleister Crowley, because Crowley was around. So Thomas wouldn't go near Crowley. So Crowley was running the Lobster Pot as a meeting place for the occult coven and society that were running from places around Newlyn. Trevello Woods, I think, was one when they used to do blood sacrifices.
Yeah, I've heard of Trevello Woods. Yeah.
An altar.
Yeah.
But there's been ritual ceremonies taking part in Trevello Woods going back, probably prehistoric times. So there's nothing new in Cornwall with these activities. It's just that the people are attracted to here because of the granite, the whole, the dolmens, the portals,
Yes.
So, it's quite right. There was a coven in Malzol, as there were covens in many other places. And Mary Butts, who was living in Sennan, was a very well-to-do artist. Her great-grandfather was a patron of William Blake. So she's part of that kind of...
She was a novelist as well, wasn't she, of course?
Yeah, neo-romantic. She was a bit of a, not part of the main scene, but she was heavily into the occult. And she actually went to Thelema Abbey in Sicily when Crowley set up the commune there in order to, she said that it was a very distressing experience because Crowley at that time had a girlfriend called Leah Hersey, who was one of his Scarlet Women.
Right.
So they were having sex with goats and things like that, performing, experimenting with the sex magic, which is something that Crowley developed, which had quite an influence on a lot of people with New Age Kundalini stuff. So Mary Butts was part of this crowd too, but whenever information about Crowley came up, suddenly it was a bit forbidden to get it mentioned. So on the fateful night, May the 22nd, 1938, when supposedly this ritual killing took place of Catherine Cox, who was good friends with Virginia Woolf, ex-lover of Rupert Brooke, who was part of this crowd as well.
The Bloomsbury lot,
Yeah. Supposedly, the Vaughans, who were a couple who were renting the Carn, Vaughan was also under investigation of spying because he then had a girlfriend who was interned called Eva Mendelssohn. He had a very strange history of living in communes again, and he gave a lot of his money that he inherited to a commune that was based on the German youth communes in the 30s. So he set up a commune at Nancledra at that time. All the stuff about him moving into the Carn, the official version is complete bollocks because, how can I put this? The guy investigating from St Ives, Hugh Prothero Smith, was a complete cover-up because, Carl Cox did die. There's various people who believe the reason that she died was because Crowley summoned up a reptile.
Entity, reptoid.
Yeah, because there's other people down here. I mean, like, the thing is, there's so many strange beliefs down here, and that when you're actually in this area, none of them really seem that fanciful. So there's people that have gone into the whole draconian stuff. That summoned up a reptile. And if you go up to the Carn, I mean, the rocks are all in the shape of reptiles. So, plus there was a lot of hallucinogenic drugs around at that time. Crowley was a habitual user of cocaine, of peyote, mescaline, plus all the mind-altering stuff that he could do through his transcendental meditation. So he was always in an altered state. And I think using the orgies and the drug taking, he managed to infiltrate a lot of these secret societies. And of course, the aristocracy being very weak-willed, are easy to suck into these things. But that thing with Hess, I mean, that was the combination of what have been similar things that have been going on down here in the 30s, because Hess was involved with the English aristocracy in the sense that he was in the German OTO, and it was Hess, Himmler, and to a certain extent Hitler, who were really interested in the occult.
Yes.
So Hess had come into contact with people like Lord Tredegar, with Mosley, Oswald Mosley, of course.
Yes, for black shirts,
So when they set up this trap to trap Rudolf Hess, because Rudolf Hess actually wasn't one of the worst Nazis, no, it's relative, but he was actually pro-English, and he wanted to end the war. So they had a team of astrologers giving fake astrological charts
to try to lure him in,
and also luring information through their occult societies through the one that we were running here. So a lot of it is misinformation. Anyway, he came over here, and one of the subplots of this is that they actually wanted to. The English, for many reasons, didn't want the war to stop.
Right.
It's too good business.
It sounds like Ukraine today, yeah.
Exactly. So they lured Hesse into this trap. Supposedly they were going to install the Prince of Wales at the time, who was, incarcerated with Wallis Simpson. Wallis Simpson was also the mistress of Ribbentrop.
Right, I didn't know that.
Yeah, the Prince of Wales was gay, so they had a lot of information on what the Prince of Wales had been up with. So basically, they were going to be installed on the throne by the Nazi sympathisers here, which effectively were the ruling elite, the Illuminati families, bankers, and the occultists. So, in a sense, Hesse was double-crossed. And Ian Fleming, he wanted Crowley to interview Hesse, because Crowley had done this work before, and because there was a connection between the two of them, he thought he could, be good. But that was not accepted by Churchill.
Right.
Churchill, although he was a Druid, I think Crowley was a bit out of his comfort zone. So they got somebody else to interview Hesse, and then of course, he was incarcerated and banged up in prison and died, or was murdered in prison. Right. But what is equally interesting is that at that time, I know you like rock and roll and all that. I've done a lot of work on the Stones and people like that. At that time, there was another commune called the Grief Commune, which was another commune set up on the basis of the one I described earlier with Frieda von Richthofen and Carl Jung running the New Forest, and that was run by a guy called Glyn Faithful.
Okay.
Glyn Faithful was another member of MI5 who was charged with the task of interviewing or debriefing Himmler after the war. Okay. So supposedly he didn't realise that Himmler had a suicide tablet. So therefore the narrative was that he'd killed himself before Glyn Faithful could extract the information. But I suspect, like everything else, he was brought into the system, recruited. Now, Glyn Faithful's daughter, of course, was Marianne Faithful.
Right. I was just wondering if there's a connection. Okay.
Pat Doherty as his high priestess, who was clearly extremely psychic. I don't think there's any doubt about that, and most of her friends have verified that. So the people like Tyne and Crowley, who were running convents or occult societies, you then employ. And Crowley was of the belief that the female, the moon child stuff, the moon goddess, which underlines a lot of the philosophies of, romantic poets, romantic writers. The whole tenet of romanticism is partly linked in with the ancient pagans of moon goddess worship, which is a bit Mermaid of Zeno stuff. There's a lot about Tregurthan, but that's why I'm making a documentary film and writing the book. But the Mermaid of Zeno is another beautiful little story here, which I can just briefly touch on. I've always been fascinated by mermaids and pirates. It's probably the whole web or not taken thing that, I mean, when you do DNA research into mitochondria, DNA that is in our body has got 15 generations of DNA. So the consciousness that we have holds the muscle memory or the consciousness of probably going back 15 generations before it gets degraded. So when people talk about past life regression or suddenly having instincts or intuition, that's probably related to the inherited characteristics and inherited genes that we've got. So the reason I'm interested in pirates and mermaids is that when I started doing genealogical research, found that my ancestor Alexander Osborne, 8 generations back, had taken part in this attempt to overthrow the monarchy.
The Monmouth Rebellion.
Yeah. One of the two of the people he was involved with, one of hundreds, it wasn't just him, were Daniel Defoe and a doctor called Dr. Peter Blood. They were captured. So Dr. Peter Blood, because he was...
Captain Blood, was that? Yeah.
Yeah, he was captured. He was actually sent as a slave to the Caribbean. At that time, they were sending white working class people to be slaves to other white landowners in the Caribbean. So Peter Blood was sent there. He was a bit of a swashbuckling character, so he escaped and became a pirate.
Right.
So he became Captain Blood, Pirates of the Caribbean.
Yeah.
So then I figured, I was always watching the Buccaneers when I was young, I remember that program. So this whole mythology about pirates and mermaids, it all fits into Cornwall as well. So I've subsequently found out that where I'm living now, my ancestors lived in the Middle Ages, and that Wicker was owned by someone with the same name as me. So there's all these synchronicities. But the mermaid one was really freaky, because when I took custodianship of Tregerthen, the farm here, the previous owners were kind of good witches, and there was a mermaid statue outside the cottage. Right. They said, we don't move the mermaid statue. So I thought, that's great. Then I started researching the mermaid of Xenor myth, which we can go into another time. Then I got a mermaid tattoo on my forearm because I suddenly got into the whole thing about mermaids. And like as usual, we all have these fantasies about they lure men into the sea, and they've got long curly blonde hair and green eyes, and they embody the Aphrodite myth. So I had that, and then about 6 months ago, I got a phone call from someone or a message, and someone said, I saw on Instagram that you had a picture of your arm with a mermaid on it, and I've also got Xenor written on my arm, so I get a discount in the local pub that's in his arms, because if there's no staff that know me there in the summer, I just show them that, and that's my barcode, and I get 10% off. So she said, I want to come and do some research, because there's a missing link that goes to Xenor. And I said, what's your name? And she said, Truhella. Well, the boy that was taken by the mermaids was called Matty Truhella.
That's right. That's right. Do you know what? That rang a bell when you said that. Yeah,
Matty Truhella. So the mermaid chair that was carved in the 15th century.
Right.
Part of this fable, Matthew Truhella had a lovely voice. The mermaids...
chorister in the choir. Yeah.
Sirens like so they lured him down to the cove, which is Pendor Cove, which is where I swim, because closest cove to me. He was never to be seen again, but if you go down there, you can still hear his angelic voice coming over the ocean. Now, it's likely that this is a fable that the Cornish invented, either to make money or because to cover up the fact that he was taken by witches or by, who knows. But in any case, I said, your name is Truhella. She said, yeah. I said, you need to come out to my place, Tregerthen. I'll show you the deeds of this house. Well, the Truhella family lived here until 1920.
Right.
So I've got the mermaid statue outside the cottage. There's also a Baphomet statue as well, but we won't go into that. Right. And I've got the tattoo on my arm. A woman who's tracing her ancestry, and she came out and she said, the minute she walked in the courtyard here, she had a really strange sensation. She said, well, be that your ancestors here. So, there's something in this spirit of place that if you haven't lived somewhere else before, it's very likely that one of your ancestors has. Now, I had that with Venice when I was a child.
Yeah.
So, but this part of Cornwall, what I'm saying is that your psychic abilities multiply manifold. And I've noticed that. I've always known that I'm psychic, but I've noticed that since I've been here the last 2 years, the amounts of phenomenal experiences that occur are just off the scale. And also I get people come and stay here. Normally they're creative types, and they experience exactly the same thing. So clearly there's something in the air.
There's something there, isn't there? Yeah.
Lawrence would call it blood consciousness, which gets trapped into the granite. Right. Or into the ley line structure, which is like one great big, full of what's the word? It's like an acupuncture grid or a mother board on a computer, underneath the earth.
Yes.
So people like Lawrence, to a certain extent, come in and they can tap into this, and that's why they're drawn here. And also it's why the Nazis were interested in it, and it's why Crowley, was so active and so successful here with his activities, because
it inspires the creativity, doesn't it?
Yeah, people do it.
Did he write Sons and Lovers? Did he write that when he was?
Yes.
He did write that when he was there.
Lawrence's best book, in my opinion, and that's not just because it was written here, was Women in Love.
Okay.
So he wrote that in 1617 entirely. That is the novel of Tregerthen. That's the one that he wrote here. He also wrote The Fox, about a nearby farm who's about two lesbians, one of whom whose granddaughter I know. So Women in Love was really that whole philosophy that was developed out of that commune in 1912. The dynamics and the relationships between men and women, exploring homosexuality, a lot of other themes about blood consciousness in one with the land. So he had an affair with the local farmer here, William Hocking.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's right. I remember reading about
the Hocking family. Well, I know some of the Hocking families. They don't really, they're not very forthcoming on that. But there was a very good interview with Stanley Hocking done in the 60s for someone.
C.J. Stephen.
Yeah, that's it. That's really interesting.
Yeah,
because again, Danny Hocking doesn't. He's very kind of reserved about it. But if you read Frida's book, Not I But the Wind, Frida Richthofen's biography, that she admits it, and then other people, when you go to people's letters and things like that, rather than the official narrative, it's been confirmed by several other people, including Cecil Gray. So the relationship between the two men in Women in Love, between Rupert Birkin, which is the embodiment of D.H. Lawrence, and Gerald Critch, who is Middleton Murray. So Lawrence also was trying to get Middleton Murray to involve himself in blood ritual sacrifices that were taken from the German. This is to do with the Bruderschaft, which is the German secret societies where you cut each other and swap blood. So Lawrence, being to a certain extent a gullible romantic, was open to all of these activities, and he was exploring lots of them.
Yes,
and the relationship also between the two women, which is Gudrun, which was
Frida.
Yeah, Gudrun was Frida. Yeah, and I forgot the other guy's name.
Kathleen Mansfield.
Kathleen Mansfield was Rupert's. I forgot her name. But anyway, the foursome that lived together in that cottage.
She had the tower, didn't she? Yeah.
And the sinister character in it, I think, is called Halliday, was Peter Warlock.
Right.
And the other characters were locals who were just like, extras in this drama that was unfolding in Lawrence's head around these four people. So in a sense, you've got this little kind of quite claustrophobic little world, which he's writing about it. Mm-hmm. And people like Cecil Gray, who was actually a composer rather than a writer, said, well, Lawrence just used to get these people here and almost be like a Magus figure, just use them as characters in his novels. Right. So there was constant falling outs, attempted, suicides and things like that. And the whole thing around him was completely full of drama, just as it was when Crowley was around. So the whole of the 20th century, this tiny little hamlet has been like the venue for probably the two of the most important counterculture.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
20th century in Lawrence and Crowley.
Yeah,
they are the counterculture.
It's amazing how it all comes back to that tiny area, and yet, like as you know, like 99% of people haven't got a clue. It's and I hear people. I listen to a lot of podcasts on sort of this sort of a fringy sort of stuff. I'm trying to think of his name. I listened to one the other day about Castaneda.
Castaneda,
yeah. And basically, I was listening to this conversation, and it was something I didn't know anything about. I just heard the name. But every now and again, some of the things that this lady talking about, it was about her days involved with this cult. It just rang so many bells with the information that I've got from yourself and from reading these books on Lawrence and Crowley and so on. It was the same thing going on over there in, I think it was California.
Oh yeah, absolutely. All these cults with the cult of Sam and the Suicide one. They were all, including the Polanski one, the Sharon Tate. I mean, they were all run by CIA operatives.
What's the name of that?
Kenneth Anger, Leary, they were all involved with this. Aldous Huxley was really masterminding this as well.
Right.
And it was that was controlled by Crowley, and Huxley was controlling Lawrence. When Lawrence died, who was there? It was Huxley. 2 years later, he wrote Brave New World. So then Huxley went to California, set up the Sonnenkinden, which is called the Children of the Sun, along with people like Christian Isherwood and others. And this is all the philosophies that were developed at this commune, along with some of the leading psychotherapists in the world at that time, including Adler, Wilhelm Reich, the concept of vegetarianism, living close to nature, all straight and idyllic, the communes, but a lot of them were based on old Bavarian practices. When they set up these movements, they sped it all up because like the punk movement only lasted for a year or two. And in the 60s, they created the hippie movement that was around Southern California in, what's that valley?
Is this Laurel Canyon? Laurel Canyon.
Laurel Canyon, which is fascinating because some of my favorites were Laurel Canyon.
Me too, yeah.
Their fathers were in the military. Frank Zappa's father was in the military. Jim Morrison's father was in the military. They're all, unbelievable links between the military-industrial complex and the counterculture.
Well, I often look at Laurel Canyon, and I've watched a few documentaries on, all the goings on behind the scenes, like you just mentioned, and I think of it very much like the St Ives scene. It's just a bigger scale.
Yeah.
You've got all these artists, you've got all these musicians, all these writers, all attracted to a place.
Yeah.
And then, coming from a land which gets you back to Lawrence again, and the blood bonds, and Bruder Bond and place, and
it's not a coincidence. I mean, I've had this discussion with the children of some of the famous artists here.
Right.
Like I don't really want to tell them a lot of this stuff that their grandfathers or their fathers were kind of involved in occult societies in order for their careers to prosper. But I've done all the work on that, so I know all the galleries.
Yeah.
But the thing is, there's a reason. It's not just the quality. People say, all the artists came because of the quality of life. Well, a lot of the artists that came down here after the war had worked in intelligence services, like Sven Berlin. Brian Winter was involved with Solly Zuckerman, and they were doing experiments on monkeys. But during the war, they were doing experiments. Sven was at Bristol Zoo. Brian Winter and Guido Morris were working in Oxford, and they were doing experiments on the hormones of apes. Also, they were doing vivisection. And part of the cover story on this was that they wanted to send a man into space to compete with the Russians, and that their first person they'd send would be a monkey. So people thought, it's great, it's worth doing these experiments on these monkey, because the first monkey will be in space. In fact, it was just a cover for the experiments they were later to do on children.
Yes.
So a lot of these survived artists were unwittingly bought into these agendas. Berlin's great. I mean, I was only working on him today, actually, because he used to hang out up at the Cairn quite a lot with Brian Winter.
Brian Winter,
and Lanyon as well. And of course, one of my old friends, Sandra Blow, as well. So I'm literally working on that at the moment. And I'm trying to limit it to what they did here at Tregerthen Zenor, because St Ives has pretty much been documented by many people, but no one's gone into this area of research where I'm specifically looking at the links between the occult and the art scene and the counterculture. And also when you're in the Nazi spy stuff, then you've got like a cocktail. Kind of what was this big mystery about Sven Berlin having to leave Cornwall in the same way that the had to leave Cornwall next day. Sven Berlin never really goes into it because he'd formed friendships with a lot of the aristocratic or the artistic elite that were running here pretty much like a mafia. Yeah. And because his face didn't fit, or maybe he wasn't in the right Freemasonry groups, or he wasn't prepared to do a deal with the devil. He was had a healthy mind, healthy body. It's possible that they just froze him out. And his book was pulp.
Wasn't it Peter Lanyon that froze him out?
Yeah, it was partly Lanyon, partly Nicholson. It's weird because Berlin and Lanyon were great friends. The other thing about artists down here is that they can fall out at any given moment about anything. Just what happened to H. Lawrence and Middleton Murray, and these people were his closest friends. He was living with them, and yet when he wrote the book about them, they'd say, "Why have you written this about me?" Because he actually tears them to shreds. So, to a certain extent, it's the artistic temperament, and nobody's got a good word to say about people after they have this falling out. And I'm not saying the falling out is due to anything sinister. It could just be like a clash of ego.
You've been listening to Cuckoo Town, a Leviathan Media production, copyright Mark Anthony Wyatt 2022. If you've enjoyed the show, please subscribe, like, share, save us on your laptop and all that good stuff. And please do tell your like-minded friends about Cuckoo Town. You can find us on all the major platforms, and we'll be on YouTube too. I'll see you next time then, when we'll take another stroll together down a road less travelled. Bye for now. Be lucky. Oh, the cuckoo, she's a pretty bird. She warbles as she flies, but she never hollers cuckoo until the 4th day of July. Jack of diamonds, you're the meanest heart I know. Well, you're up my poor pockets, my silver and gold. I'm going up on a mountain, gonna build me a whiskey still, and I'll sell you one bottle for a $20 bill. Going up on a mountain, gonna stand there looking down, so I can see my pretty baby whenever she comes around. Oh, the cuckoo, she's a pretty bird. She warbles as she flies, and she never hollers cuckoo
I have come here to chew bubblegum and kick ass. And I'm all out of bubblegum.